Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Today, we're going to talk about GG Games' post that they put out on what we're working on, and also something they put out yesterday that I considered making a video on, but didn't actually get around to at the time, which is good because it's actually going to roll in well to this. The other things that'll come up in this video, they're going to talk a little bit about some of the patches that have taken place so far. Not necessarily every single hotfix, but the ones that have major impactful fixes. Let's start with GG Games' investigation into player complaints about breaches decreasing loot because they're displacing a lot of monsters just by virtue of taking up a lot of floor space. Now, the intended behavior is that monsters that would normally be placed within the area of a Hive encounter, that these are not removed entirely from the map. Instead, they're compensated for by placing other monsters elsewhere in the map. So if 30% of the map is taken up with a breach hive, that area has next to no natural inhabitants in it, but that 30% of the map is then shoved into the other 70%, adding a lot of density there. That's the intended behavior. What did they find when they went to explore whether this was what was happening or not? Well, they found that there were two particular methods of adding monsters to maps that were genuinely having problems here. The first one was shrines. This one was fixed in patch 3.270b hotfix 2. This one then fixed the problem, so this for the last 24 hours hasn't been the case. But for the first 5 or 6 days of the league, it was the case that if a shrine spawned inside one of these areas, not only were the monsters not present with the shrine, but they were also not compensated for anywhere else in the map. The second genuine problem they've found is the essence scarab of calcification. Now, essences are a mechanic that people are generally moving away from in this league. And that's because the Genesis tree produces a lot of loot that competes with some of the things you might create with essences in a normal league. And as a result, whilst there probably will eventually be demand for the top end essences later, right now demand is not very high for essences. If you're playing in solo self-found, you're not using essences, you're using the Genesis tree instead to craft your own gear. And if you're playing in trade enabled, then essence prices are just completely in the dumpster because, again, the Genesis tree tends to be better. So not very many people are using essences, and that means that the essence scarab of calcification problem isn't really coming up for a lot of people. Anyway, these two were genuinely causing problems. The breach hives were genuinely deleting monsters in these cases. However, other testing that they've done, natural monsters, they're working as intended. Divination Scarab of the Cloister, Ambush Scarab of Containment, these are working as intended. The new monsters that are being added, they're still being added whether a breach hive is present or not. I don't know whether this is an exhaustive test. It's probably the case that there's 2 or 3 other more esoteric combinations that are causing problems at the moment that might get picked up in a later patch. But that was the state of affairs before GG Games' post this morning. Keepers of the Flame, what we're working on. Here, they're going to go through a few of the things that they're talking about. I do think it's worth noting, though, that something they don't really talk about here that is only affecting maybe the top 5% of the player base at the moment. Map modifier effect on the Atlas passive tree was significantly nerfed in this patch. This was intended for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's hidden difficulty. There's times your character dies and it's to very obvious difficulty decisions that you've made. Let's say, for instance, you've just completed the campaign, you grab a tier 8 map off trade, and you throw it into the map device and see whether you can beat it or not, but you end up getting absolutely and utterly crushed and 6 portal failing it. That is one of those cases where the decision to put a tier 8 map into the map device is the obvious cause of why you died. But sometimes the reason that you ended up dying is because 27 maps ago, you made the decision to allocate a bunch of 2% or 3% map modifier effect nodes, and that decision finally catches up with you. There is a causal connection between your character's death and the decisions that caused it, but they're so far separated in time that that causal connection is not very clear to you when you're trying to assess why you went splat. And ultimately, nerfing map modifier effect was about decreasing that. But another factor I think GG Games were looking at is what percentage of item drops fall for the top 1% of the player base. So for instance, of every Mage Blood that drops across the league, is it 70% of them that drop in the hands of the top 1% of the player base? Is it 95% of them that drop in the hands of the top 1% of the player base? GG Games would have stats, we don't. The map modifier effect was increasing that percentage quite substantially, especially with how high it was scaling in the past. So they nerfed it and they replaced it with a couple of other things. Now, if you're in tier 16.5 and tier 17 maps already, then you will be feeling these nerfs. These were a targeted nerf aimed at you. If you're not in that top 5% or so of the player base, these intended nerfs to loot will not be affecting you yet. They'll probably eventually start affecting you in a month or so, but they're not affecting you so far. That's the rest of the background. Let's go through the post today. It's been almost a week since the launch of Keepers, and our team continues to monitor community feedback. Over the past few days, we've deployed several hotfixes and a patch to address some of the issues players have been experiencing. In this post, we want to talk about what we're currently working on. So firstly, we want to reassess the rewards from breach monsters in map areas with an eye to making the league mechanic encounters more directly rewarding, and thus more worth the time to engage with. I think one of the things that we're seeing here is that players are outscaling breach loot through other things. So breach was feeling absolutely the most lucrative thing to do in the map when you were running an elk and go tier 8 map with no scarabs. But once you get to tier 16 triple scarab maps, you found that yeah, the breach encounter got slightly better, but everything else on the map got miles better. As a result, the breach then couldn't keep up. And part of that is actually due to those things we're talking about with map modifier effect. In the past, map modifier effect would have been scaling up the quantity, the rarity, and the pack size of the breach encounter. Nowadays, it still does that, but it does so by less. And because map modifier effect, and for that matter, the number of explicit modifiers that are present on a map, that triple dips on loot, that ends up with quite an impactful feel. So right now, players' loot from non-breach sources is outscaling the loot from breach sources, and Granny Games want to investigate that. Chances are what I think they'll do here is just directly buff the loot from breach monsters, and that'll mean that people who start the league very late, they will find that the breach monsters are staggeringly rewarding when they're doing their early progression, but we'll have to see exactly what they choose to do here. We're aware of the feedback regarding Hive encounters, with players feeling frustrated by having to spend too much time destroying walls before the encounter. We're investigating an option to allow a large number of walls to be destroyed at the start of the encounter. This would be fantastic. I just want these encounters to be faster than they are now. I still enjoy these Hive encounters, but they definitely could do with a speeding up there. Now this one will be interesting for build design. We have another batch of Foulborn uniques which didn't quite make it into launch, and which will be going in the next restart patch. Now, before I stopped working on that video in order to do this one, I was actually working on a video on some of the most exciting of the Foulborn uniques. Some of the ones that are really built around at a variety of prices, not really looking at the very expensive ones like the Culling Strike Headhunter ones, but some of the cool stuff that's around. Anyways, it looks like there's going to be more of those. Another thing that's really interesting with the Foulborn uniques, they do tend to be very, very, very cheap for the amount of power that they give you. This isn't quite always true. There's a couple of exceptions to this, but Foulborn uniques, the supply on them is really high. They have high drop rates in general, with the exception of Headhunter and a couple of others. They have really high drop rates, and as a result, they're very, very available if you're wanting to just mess around. At the same time, the fact that they are mostly so common means that they're less exciting as loot when they drop, but that's the way Grinding Games have decided to go here. Make them more common, make them more available. Now here's them addressing things that are being complained about currently by the top 5% of the player base, but that will start affecting more of the endgame player base over time. This is people complaining about endgame juicing not scaling very much. So outside of breach-specific changes, we're aware of feedback from players that late endgame farming strategies are currently lacking in diversity and progression. We're putting together a list of adjustments to address this, with an emphasis on making currently underperforming strategies more competitive. We're targeting next week for the release of these changes. A larger amount of changes to this area are planned for 3.28. I do not envy Grinding Games trying to get this right, and that's because trade economies are PvP environments. They don't look like it, but they are. My win is your loss if you've got the same item that I do. I had a Cadigan's Authority drop for me, second most expensive item I've had drop so far in this league. I went to try and sell it, and my immediate reaction was, I don't want to sit on this long term, I want it gone fast. Let's get into a PvP war, aka an undercutting match, with someone else that's listed the item. Someone else has listed it at 16 divines. I'm thinking, right, I'm going to undercut it and I'm going to list it at 13. Then someone counter undercut me to 10, and I was thinking, do I want to get into a fight over this at the moment or not? And I chose not to, but ultimately I could have undercut again. I could have gone to 9 or 8, and it may have ended up that that was the right decision, but it's not the decision I made. But you can see here that there's a real PvP environment that's going on, where my lucky drop seriously hurt the wealth of the other players who already owned the same item. Now that's an extremely low supply and an extremely low demand item. It's more extreme in cases like that, but the same is true even on medium supply, medium demand items. Void Battery. No one is going to deny that this is one of the best items in Path of Exile. Yet, this league, it's very cheap, And that's despite the fact that using it is as popular as ever, this item is still extremely good, and it's still quite rare. I've personally not had any of them drop for me. As a combination of the fact that a lot of them are dropping, because not many are dropping for each individual juicer, but there's a lot of people juicing maps at the moment, so there's a lot of them entering circulation, and there's just not all that many of them that are wanted. And so what you would achieve if you were to boost the drop rates of Void Battery is not that people feel, oh cool, I'm getting more loot, I'm now getting more of this item that I want. Instead, people would just remove it from their loot filter, and they would feel they're getting very, very slightly less loot than they were before, even though they're technically getting more. And this is the really difficult balancing act. Prior to 3.27, this was somewhat ameliorated by the fact that you were only having to undercut people that were online, but now you have to undercut people that are offline as well, and that's meant that there's a real race to the bottom in the value of a lot of the items that exist. This doesn't really apply for Divine Orbs, Scarabs, and other consumables like Chaos Orbs, but a big part of that is that we're limited to only 10 listings on Faustus's currency exchange, and that provides real limitations to how much people like me that flip on Faustus's exchange can end up affecting prices there. So, Grinding Games have got a really difficult problem to try and solve here in order to make loot feel good in an era where asynchronous trade is the norm. One of the things I would personally suggest they do, I don't think this is a perfect solution, but I think it might be something that improves things in the medium term, is pick a list of unique items that players do genuinely want and give them an affinity to certain types of blockable content or Atlas content in general. For example, you might decide that you're going to assign Void Battery to the Legion mechanic. In that case, Void Battery is currently a tier 2 drop anywhere unique. Maybe nerf it so that it's tier 1 drop anywhere, which is perhaps a 50 or 60% nerf in its drop rate from regular monsters, but make it so that if you're fighting a Legion monster, it's buffed to tier 3 or even tier 4. Tier 3 being a 500% buff in its drop rate, and tier 4 being something like a 2700% buff in its drop rate. And the other thing you'd need to do is communicate these biases on unique items to players. Then if it turns out that in a given league, Legion is just underperforming for whatever reason, well, suddenly Void Batteries are going to get really rare, there's not going to be many of them on the Trade League economy, and players might start jumping into Legion in order to try and chase down that particular unique item that's gone up in price. At the same time, if Legion's really good for other reasons, well, Void Battery is not going to be loot anymore. It's going to be basically free, and people that want to use it, well, that's great for them. For people that succeed in looting one from somewhere, well, that's going to be a disappointing moment, but most drops are disappointing. In the past, Grinding Games have gone more extreme with this, and they've made it so that certain unique items are only available from League mechanics. I think that's the wrong way to go here, because that's just going to make killing generic monsters less exciting. Still want to have it so that exciting drops can happen from every monster in the game. That's why they originally made it so that Headhunter and Mageblood could drop from regular monsters, is they wanted to have exciting drops that could happen from any monster in the game. And whilst they don't always succeed with Headhunter, some leagues it isn't worth very much, it is still a case that most people leave unique leather belts on their filter, even when mathematically it's probably not the right choice to do so. That's my thoughts on where they could go there, but ultimately this is a very, very difficult problem for Grinding Games to get right. I think they might have actually underestimated the amount that asynchronous trade would change the Trade League economy, and it is something I did predict before the league came out, that the first week Reddit would be full of "where's the loot" comments, and that was something I was definitely hoping to be wrong on. Anyways, that's Grinding Games' problem to try and solve now. That's what Grinding Games are working on, and they're aiming to deploy significant changes next week, and potentially more updates as to what's coming after that. I'm going to leave it there. May your Val Orbs have interesting results.